Hi, Ernie. Sorry I'm late.
All right.
How are you? Yeah.
Start the recording. Oops, I don't have host permission here. I may need to log in as Ted. Give me a minute.
All right.
And I'm back, and I'm recording, and I am not myself, so I will. All right. Hello again, Bill.
Good morning. How are you?
Doing good.
It's Friday. We made it.
We did. That's a nice view. Is that downtown Los Angeles?
Yeah, it's really nice. It's foggy, overcast. LA looks so much better, right? In that misty, moody fog. It's so peaceful because nobody's here, right? It's a ghost town. It's very surreal. You go to down LA Live, down by the No Kid Theater and Staples, like just people walking dogs.
Yeah, I remember the first time I went to a mall was like pick up some eyeglasses for my son, and it really felt like the zombie apocalypse.
Yeah, that's how I'm feeling for other reasons as well. Yeah.
Well, hopefully we can get some dry bones back to life.
Yeah, all right, let's do it.
All right.
What was the topic? I forgot.
Well, I actually wanted to help you debrief my interactions with David Johnson.
Yeah, I did a little bit, and it sounded positive. So let's hear the good stuff.
Yeah, let me see if I can get the my website here. Let me share my screen. So it's actually really funny is that we were trying to do Zoom, but it was just an epic fail because of his audio connections. So we ended up doing the Uber conference instead, which is great because that has the automated transcript stuff turned on. I haven't figured out how to get that working with YouTube.
Yeah, I think I mentioned that we should try doing something like that for our presentation sessions. It's Steve's acronym, the concern.
Critical Friends Protocol, Critical Community Protocol. Yeah, I think, so there's two things. One is getting it set up, but I'm pretty sure that, because like sometimes when I'm watching a YouTube video and I have closed captions turned on, it will show me automated transcription, but sometimes it won't, and I don't know why or how. And so I guess that's something worth doing. Anyway, it's funny.
Cool. It's great. It's really good to go back and review this, right?
Yeah, and this one too was the first time I actually went through and read it, and oh, here we go. This was the money quote from Tuesday. Scaling authenticity and accountability beyond small groups. And so that was a key insight, and it was a real good way of framing the problem. And it's not identical to, what is discipleship and all that, but in my mind at least, they are equivalent or substantially overlapping.
Right.
Right. And I think that's the thing that was kind of the meta point I was trying to make was that, look, I don't expect all of us to want or need exactly the same thing. But if we can find an overlap where we all agree that this common thing helps all of us get to where we want to go, that's sufficient. And if even David and I can agree on this, and then we can,
And us as the people on the TGR calls?
Well, to start with, yes, obviously the goal is to get the whole world on the same page about what it means to follow Jesus so we can all help each other. But, I'll settle for the 6 of us in one call actually agreeing what we're doing for once.
Yeah, what an audacious goal. Yeah.
So here's the funny part.
One quick right? So
Okay,
this goes
sorry.
to when I said, please share a positive discipleship experience and put a grade on it. And everyone said mine was A, but the asterisk is, but it was, a one-off because that person or that place. And, I know you talked to David about that. So repeatable / scalable.
Yeah. And then the interesting thing was the follow-on bit. Here we go. Yeah, is that I was riffing on something, and then this is where he waffles quite a bit before sharing the data point.
This is line 233.
Yeah, 233. Great. It's cool to have numbers like this.
Yeah, I think a lot of the reasons you see leadership not to be accomplished because of the primary job ensuring integrity of the group that, all right, translate. I'll let you translate. No, just give me your version.
Right, the issue is that, the way organizations are set up today, leaders have a primary job, which is ensuring the continuity of the group. And that is in tension with.
Whoa, you have not dealt with Sequoia Capital, have you? Well, the group, the mission of the group as opposed to people, big difference.
So why don't you unpack what you mean by that, the difference between people and mission?
The first thing Sequoia did after they got their money in was they fired all the founders and brought in the adults. But the vision didn't.
Sorry. Okay, sorry. You. I think you said something important. It seemed like a total non sequitur, so I want to make sure. I want to unpack that a bit.
Well, yeah. Is the group the mission, the abstract on paper text, or is it the people? They should not be confused that they're one and the same.
Okay, let me stop sharing because I want to see your face while we have this conversation. Did I stop sharing?
Yes.
Oh, I did. Okay, good.
No, I'm sorry. Not yet.
Not yet. So what happened to my control bar? Zoom, what are you doing to me? Always show meeting controls. Where are you hiding meeting controls? Oh, there it is. Okay, stop share. That was a weird glitch. All right, now I can bring my chat video up and see your face at the same time. Okay, so what is group? Right, so let's be more precise when we talk about institutions, because I think that's how it's usually described. At least Purnell goes with it, right? So institutions have many things, right? They have they have people, they have a mission, and they have a power structure. And are you familiar with Purnell's iron law of bureaucracy?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right? And so the idea that the leader's primary job, in Purnell's view, is maintaining the power structure of the organization, independent of the people and almost independently of the mission.
Yeah, because if you lose power, you risk losing a lot of stuff. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and most people cannot imagine, understandably so, that, and actually this is the other point that David and I talked about. We got hung up on the word structure, but I was trying
to. I know. Yeah.
So I introduced the architectural idea of load-bearing walls, right? Is the idea that there are certain things that are essential for the organization to survive. And if you get rid of that, then the organization dies. Like, for example, making enough money to cover your bills is a thing, yeah. Right? And it's been really interesting to see organizations that have and have not adapted to COVID-19. Right, so it's easy to think about organizations like churches where you have a weekly in-person large gathering, and there's a whole set of issues around that. But there's another set of issues of organizations where their activity doesn't require large gatherings, but their fundraising always has, right? And that 80% of the revenue comes from these big fancy dinners they throw once a year.
Right.
And if they're, and so those are the, let's call it essential functions. Maybe that's a better term. And so
why does Maslow's pyramid suddenly pop into my mind?
yeah, it's a great way of thinking about it. And we know how that applies to individuals. I've not heard people talk about it in the context of organizations, but it makes perfect sense, right? Is that if paying the bills is at the bottom level and accomplishing the mission is at the top, then
yeah. Let's stick with architecture, because obviously right here. So yeah, there's these massive steel load-bearing things. Then there's the hot tub and the social function. Oh yeah, cool.
Right, and you could blow out all the windows of the building, and the building will still stand.
Right,
but
also jack up the rents, and all the current people are out the door, and so the institution survives if you ignore people.
Right, and on the flip side, which happened in LA in the 70s and 80s, the buildings can stand and the landlord can just let it go to pot. And so it becomes crappier and crime infested, but people could still live there and be more miserable.
Right.
And it's still functioning.
Why you beating around the bush? I know you're talking church, it's not LA slum.
I wasn't thinking about that just yet. But I think it's to illustrate the principle that, like, okay, if the purpose of the building is to make money for the owner, then he doesn't really care whether it's a crack house or a brothel or a family unit or an office building.
Well, to the extent that it doesn't impact making money.
Right, and if he makes the rational calculation that by neglecting maintenance,
right,
and jacking up rents because people have no option, then he can make more money than if he actually invests in creating a livable community, right? And so,
right. Or you tear down the trailer home community that's been there for 40 years and sell to a big time developer. Right?
Yeah, and there's also an interesting tension there, which is from the perspective of the institution, there's one set of incentives and rules and mores. When you have multiple institutions or ecosystem, it gets a lot complicated. Like, for example, I think the reason it confused me at first is you were talking about like VCs who invest in a startup and then they fire the leadership. And so there's a different institution that is redefining an existing institution. And what is the principle there, right? When you change the ownership, what obligation do they have to the institution? And, in some cases, I would argue the VC model of firing the founders and bringing in professional management is necessary for accomplishing the mission. Other cases, it's extremely short-sighted and vicious. And then whether or not it's
tricky, that's tricky because there's actually two institutions, right? So there's Sequoia with its mission, and then there's the individual company that they're investing in. So that's a little bit trickier. It's more like,
yeah, that's why I was a little confused why you went there.
Well, so maybe that maps close to a Catholic Church model, right? That the Vatican can shut down this or that church or swap in a new bishop or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. So there's a question of ownership, which is interesting, right? Of who owns it and what does ownership mean, and who has practical power. And I think there's two different parts of that. There's a sense of practical power, and there's a sense of moral authority. And from a, you look at a company, even just focusing on a simpler example, you've got the practical power of the stockholders in some sense.
Yeah, right. This is good. Yeah, stockholders versus board and management. So there's there's stockholders, board, yeah,
management, and there's also broadly construed stakeholders, and they all have different levels of power depending on.
I guess you could throw in the government as well.
Right, regulators.
Yeah, regulators. Yeah. And customers, I guess.
Stakeholders includes customers, employees, the community.
Okay.
Yeah, right. And what's interesting is that they each have different levels of political power. or practical power, and different structures give more or less to different groups and culture, both formally and culturally.
Right.
And interestingly, somewhat independent, not entirely independent of that, but not entirely correlated with that, is this issue of moral authority, right? So the example given how a Steve Jobs could do things at Apple that a Gil Amelio never could, even if they had the exact same roles, technically.
Yeah.
Although it wasn't entirely true, because one of the things Steve Jobs did was make sure he was both chairman and CEO. So he also had all the practical power. But even that would have been insufficient without moral authority.
Right.
And what's interesting to me is that this switch between power versus authority. And the funny thing is, most people see having more power as a good thing because I can get more done. But I see power as large, and while that's certainly true, I also see power as a shackle, because when you have certain powers, you have certain obligations, what people expected of you. I guess we have to go to the Peter Parker quote, with great power comes great responsibility. But one of the design patterns I've been wrestling with ever since my startup, I think I got this from Henri Nguyen, was that I actually like it. I was going for this thing called strategic impotence, where there's certain things that I, as the leader of the group, cannot do, so that other people feel empowered to do it. I didn't quite get there, but I got the next best thing, which is strategic incompetence, where in theory I can do everything, but no one in the group trusts me enough to do all those things, so they're always watching over my shoulder to keep me from screwing up. And therefore, they're achieving this vision that is done much more maturely in David Marquette's Turn the Ship Around, what he calls leader, where it's the job of everyone to make sure that the leader makes the right decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And to like intelligently disobey if the leader says something stupid.
Oh, this is also known as the Korea airline incident at SFO.
You want to elaborate on that?
Oh, I think it was a crash, right? They landed short of the runway. It's because of the Korean culture. The younger co-pilot, they're not saying anything to the more senior, older pilot. I think we're going to crash.
Right. So this is the fascinating thing, is that if it's the job of the leader to ensure the integrity of the group, then they have to make hard choices, right? And they have to be able to make hard choices that that go against the short-term interests of some members of the group, if that is their job. And
is that the definition of a hard choice?
I think so, right? The easy choices are ones that everyone likes,
right?
Which are win-win. But in any, like even just a simple thing like when trying to get the kids out the door in time to go make it to school.
Okay. And I throw in the Japanese, what's the word? Not quality circles, but they try to make decisions by consensus. So there's a lot of this. Right.
So this is the interesting thing, is that
as opposed to you described borderline mushroom management.
Right. So let's talk about that, because the Japanese model is funny that way, in that on one level it's incredibly consensus driven. On the other hand, it's also insanely status driven and hierarchical simultaneously. And so,
but I wonder if they developed that consensus model in recognition of the fact that the status stuff culturally and historically was there, whether it was an enlightened new approach.
Yeah, I would say that I would say it's a clever hack.
Yeah.
Right? In that it's very, because the goal is to preserve face and honor. I mean, Orson Scott Card, who I think lived in Asia at some time, he talks about it or alludes to it through some of his characters. He writes a lot of stuff set in like China and Japan or Japanese cultures.
And the face and honor, but I could make the argument this is trying to go around that. You can say hack, but I mean, it seems to be pretty respectful to say, hey, Ernie, before you just say, I'm Ernie, you have to do this.
Well, so I think the way that one of my favorite sayings is that yesterday's brilliant innovation is today's clever hack, is tomorrow's idiotic legacy.
Yeah, that's good.
Right? And so I think it was a brilliant innovation at the time, and now it's a clever hack, but it's also a really painful legacy. Having had to work in that, I mean, I have one experience of this where I was the US representative of our university in China, the very first internet drop in China for a higher energy physics experiment.
Yeah.
And it was, at the time, Americans could only be there for 2 weeks at a time. And so all the bigwigs were there for 2 weeks for the big launch of the project, and it was delayed 2 weeks. So when it finally happened, I was the peon on the scene, managing everything as the liaison. And what's funny is that I said, you know, it was awkward because the Americans were trying to tell the Chinese how to run the experiment. And it was a high pressure, time-based decision-making process. But for an American to tell a Chinese that they're doing something wrong and they need to change it was incredibly painful for the Chinese. If it had been the other way around, it would have been fine because the Chinese would be very deferential and cautious. And if the Americans put a little effort into it, they would understand what the Chinese wanted. Assuming they did. But as I say, the problem was that the Americans are not proud, but they are arrogant. Whereas the Chinese are not arrogant, but they are proud.
Yeah.
As an Indian, I am both arrogant and proud, so I can understand both sides.
So my experience was I used to work for Seiko Epson and worked in Japan for a month. Worked with a group of primarily Chinese people, and we were a company that was profiled in Stanford Business Magazine about business professors, example of a Silicon Triangle. So there's something in Silicon Valley, something in Taiwan, something in mainland China. So that's three radically different cultures. But the main experience that really pertains, I was in a Chinese church for 10 years. Now you want to talk about weird communication.
Right, so I think you would see the benefits and the downsides of that kind of status-oriented approach.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for the record, I have come to the conclusion that I lack the status-perceiving gene. Like, I am totally blind to status roles and status hierarchies in both directions, which causes all sorts of problems, but has some interesting benefits.
Yeah, no, people will catch up to you at some point. You'll save the world.
Well, here's so speaking of that, my latest theory of what it'll take to do that. So I was thinking about your challenges. What is the Holy Spirit wanting us to do? And the other really interesting thing that came up was one of the biggest challenges that I face in this whole project of the Great Reset is there's a lot of learning going on, but I don't know which things are just for me to learn and which things are things that I want to try and teach others. And I'm almost getting to the point where, I got that point kind of in season 2 when we were talking about education, is that what I actually teach people is almost irrelevant. The more interesting things are what I learn and how I can live that out. And that came out actually nicely in the retrospective. Is some of the things that came out were, people appreciated the fact that I listened and took feedback. People's favorite moments was when, really Ted's favorite moments was when somebody else got to be the star, right? When we got Steve to teach or Janet to teach. And that was the phrase, creating a platform for others to shine was a big thing. The practical challenge I've been facing is people want to feel like there's a sense of progress, that we're on goal, that we have a goal and we're working towards it.
Right.
And at some level, that's my responsibility in whatever role I have, even if I can't even define what that is, or maybe precisely because, but it's not going to happen because I exert top-down leadership in a power play, right? I say, okay, this is the purpose, and whether you like it or not, we're going to do it. That is not, I've tried it a couple of times, it just fails miserably, which is great, right? The best you can hope for is a reproducible test case, where it's like, okay, good, this is the right failing test, but how do we make progress where everyone feels like we're making progress towards a shared goal without having to play the alpha male card and just force people to conform to something?
Yeah, I mean, so this was the big thought experiment analysis development that I kind of brought to Mike Parkin's small group stuff and drew heavily from startups. If a startup is going to sit there drifting for 2 years, that's not going to make people happy.
Yeah. And the thing is, of course, the way that we do that in startups is we have the myth of the founder, right? Is that the founders are assumed to be the ones who have demonstrated devotion to the vision by their willingness to embark on this hazardous voyage at great risk, and they attract people who will follow them. And the hard part of it being a founder, or one of the hard parts, there's many hard parts, is that every time you double, the roles and responsibilities and structure change. Right, when you go from 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16, is when it's just 4 of you, when it's just you, it's really simple. When it's just 2, it's relatively simple. When it's just 4, you can all get in a room and have things, but as things scale out, or maybe factor of 10, whatever you want to call it, right? You can't have the same level of consensus-driven decision-making with 100 people that you did when you had 4. And you start getting these distances, and you start getting structures, and you also...
Well, there's this called email and the internet, which allows you to scale. You might want to check it out someday.
Well, yeah, but have you ever tried making decisions on a mailing list of 100 people?
SurveyMonkey seems to be thriving. Yeah.
Sorry, what?
SurveyMonkey seems to be thriving with what it's putting out there.
Yeah, so I have... SurveyMonkey, I know from there not being a... They're much more but I mean,
right? It seems to scale somewhat.
Sorry, what?
This thing called the American presidential election, which seems to scale a little bit. It seems to get at least 30, 40% of Americans participating.
Well, so participation, yes. How many people would you say feel, in terms of, but it's certainly not a consensus-driven process. What I was saying is that a consensus, like when you have 4 people, you get in a room, you all hear each other's point of view and you all agree, right? But precisely when we scale out, we end up doing massively lossy information channels, right? You might know when the presidential vote, it's really a binary choice practically. It's a single bit of information to represent all of your preferences, needs, desires, wants, hopes, and fears.
So the weird way of looking at it is, wow, that's a huge amount of consensus. There's not like 6 or 7 ideas floating around. We're down to 2.
Well, but is that consensus? I mean, that's a really weird way to use that term. Consensus for me has always meant where the whole group gets together and freely shares their opinions and reaches an agreement together.
Yeah, I grant you.
Voting is usually the opposite of consensus.
That seems like a scalability issue at a certain level, perhaps.
But that's precisely the scalability issue we're talking about, right? Is that as organizations get larger, the gap between the decision-making and the authentic feelings and preferences of the participants involved gets wider and wider.
Yeah, I think, so here's another case study to look at, Christianity or Christendom. There's a lot of talk about consensus. We're all followers of Christ. We all agree those 4 spiritual laws are total essence of the faith. But the way it works is if you don't agree, go away.
Right.
I mean, yeah. In America, I could move to Canada and people do that.
Right. I'm not sure if we're going in the same direction. Let me try and close the loop a bit. The interesting thing to me is, so the practical question. The practical question is how can I lead this group in a way where they feel, where people generally feel like we're making progress towards a shared purpose.
Right.
While also feeling, without having to turn in, so my point is that the traditional way to solve this problem is that there's this increasing chasm between the leaders and the members. And the leaders, have access to all the information and make the hard decisions. And there's different levels of input and buy-in from the membership. But usually it's one that tends to breed passivity and compliance, or even require passivity and compliance.
Just for clarity, can you put some numbers on it? Are we talking 8 8,000, 8 million?
I would say, so in terms of where the scale breaks down.
No, where we're headed, where we should focus our discussion. Because I can't be thinking 8 million and 8.
Sorry, I'm thinking about the 8 of us on next Tuesday.
Yeah.
Okay, so right now, the question.
And what did David have some thoughts on this?
Well, I think I had a good way of framing the problem, which is that if leadership sees their job as being the one making the hard choices to ensure the integrity of the group, that is, to me, so it's my interpretation of what David said, is that, and we talked about this before, right, is that it seems that typically when organizations scale, the ones that successfully scale is by creating this distance between the leader and the followers. So the leader has freedom of action to make hard choices. Yep. And organizations that don't do that typically fail because the leader gets bogged down in trying to keep everybody happy. And therefore they never make any hard decisions. And the critical functions, the essential functions fail to happen. So the theory, so I was praying about this and wrestling with also Janet's challenge to like, what is it in scripture that and I realized one of the things that confused me last Tuesday, when Janet talked about you have to know the Beatitudes, know the prophets, I heard that as, well, you need to study all these things. But I think a better translation would be you have to obey these things. You have to live these things out. And I was thinking about that as a guiding principle because I'm actually really good at studying and talking about scripture and fairly mediocre at best at actually living it out. And even just reading scripture in a group for the purpose of living it out is unfamiliar. And so that's one of the things I want to focus on next season. But in particular, the passage that I ended up with was one I tweeted this morning that I thought would be interesting to think through in this context. The Matthew 20 passage where he says, kings and those with great authority in this world rule over their subjects like tyrants. And that's actually a good, actually everything was, Rick Joyner talks about how, in the systems of this world, that's necessary. When you're working in the world's ways and living in PR, the reality is the most effective organizations tend to be those who have the most decisive leaders, right? The Steve Jobs,
I relate to this was I had a message Sunday, which we talked about in the small group, the two kingdoms, obviously leading up to the election, and sharp distinction between the two kingdoms. And this kingdom, it's ruled by fear. This kingdom's ruled by love. So I think if it's, fear, I think works well with this king.
And the reality is, we talked about this at the beginning, I think, with the guy who inspired the first episode of season 4, that he was involved with two groups, one of which was really relational and really authentic, and one of which was really hierarchical and law-based. And the touchy-feely group had to merge with the hierarchical group because they weren't viable, right? Because no one had the hard conversations to make sure that essential functions got done. And so after a while, the group just imploded. And so this is the interesting hard problem to solve, is what does this completely different model look like?
Hey, I wonder, can we go back to your idea from a while ago to outsource level 1 to right, and the churches do that. When I was working with Darren, we were doing pay the weekly tithe through your cell phone, and then that broadened to, well, there's a big problem here at churches. How do they raise money? And we discovered this huge world of a whole bunch of startups that it's a service platform to raise money for churches. Very sophisticated stuff.
Sorry, I don't see how that solves this problem rather than just moving it one step away, unless I'm missing what you're trying to say.
Well, so a little bit different than it's a riff on the architecture model. So it'd be like, you're not responsible for the entire building. You are more focused on the
right. So decoupling the this gets to the question of, where your heart treasure is there, that's where your heart is too, right? If 80% of our treasure is in a building and 80% of our spending is on Sunday morning, that's where our heart's going to be, right? So that's one problem. But
I
even
mean, you went crazy and said we should outsource the leader, right? And they should be on hire.
well, I know. I said outsource management of the facility.
No, this was 2 years ago. You were seriously saying we should outsource that pastor role.
Well, I may have said that, and that may be an interesting thing, but that doesn't necessarily solve the problem. If the pastor is outsourced, the question is who's responsible for what and to whom are they responsible and how are they responsible? So, the thing I may have been talking about was the idea that small groups are hiring the pastor rather than the pastor chartering the small group.
Correct. And so when you said there were these two groups, one which was touchy-feely, one was, hey, we need to pay the bills, and the touchy-feely sort of like, I don't know what happened post-merger, but it seems like
what happened post-merger is the touchy-feely was still post-merger. Well, it's interesting is that going back to the Purnell's law of bureaucracy, the people who cared about the essential functions of the group, what's called the hierarchical people, they ended up running the group. And the touchy people could show up and hang out. But what it meant was, of course, that they weren't in any positions of power. And therefore, if their desires or agenda conflicted with the hierarchicals, they got squashed, right? Because they were decoupled. They were powerless, and they were almost parasitic on the hierarchicals. Like they could innovate on the edges, but they couldn't shape the agenda or anything. And so here's the interesting, so I've been thinking about a design pattern to experiment with that might solve this problem. Let me go to the Passion Translation. No, this is the Passion Translation right here. I could have sworn I saw a different translation when I was reading it in, the translation I was reading had that the one who wants to be first among you must live as a slave. And I thought, what if we not just decoupled power from authority, but we inverted power and authority? So the role that I aspire to in the Great Reset is to be first slave. And that, because I feel like I do want to be first slave because I really care about this and I want to have the authority to invite people to this higher standard of following Jesus. But the way I want to do that is not by asking them to trust me with power, but by me entrusting them with power. And so this is kind of what, David Johnson on the chat was talking about, how we are, he's worried about whether we disagree. So I said, well, let's just assume that wherever we disagree, I'm probably wrong and you should correct me. Problem solved. Right? Because my authority doesn't come from being right or having all the answers or getting people to agree with me. My authority comes from I am totally sold out to accomplishing God's purpose for this group. And I have no idea how to do it. And I need all of you to level up in your ability to help me figure out what I'm doing wrong so I could do it better. And that, I think, is what this completely different model looks like, is that the fundamental assumption is, well, the leader knows what's best, and therefore the members ought to follow. And in this case, the first slave, primodoulos, I guess, would be the fancy Greek word to make it sound. That's probably a bastardization of Greek and Latin, but whatever. I'll go with primodoulos. I'm the one who is the designated hitter or the designated hittee or whatever, the one who's, the group expects to focus on the mission of the group, and that the rest of the group has to focus on one, playing their role in terms of it, but part of their job is to make sure that I'm doing what is necessary to help the group thrive. And it's the maximum, and this is the point about authority and accountability, is that generally speaking, those who are given authority in the world system have the power to hold other people accountable.
Right.
And by necessity of the way they exercise that power, they become less accountable than the people below them, right? I mean, any large company, right? The frontline employees are, sorry?
That's the power imbalance, yeah.
Right, well, yeah, but the whole point of the organization is that, at Apple, like Steve Jobs can spend his time however he wants, but a retail store employee has incredibly strict rules that they must follow or they're out.
Right.
Right. And the idea is that, and the reason actually I got to this was actually less thinking about how to structure the organization, but what do I want? And what I realized was that I think surprises people or is hard for people to wrap their heads around, and I'm wrestling this with my parenting, is that what I want most is to be like Jesus, is to have my character shaped so I'm learning to love like Jesus and loving more like Jesus. And therefore, it is a gift rather than a curse to be held to a higher standard and have greater scrutiny on my life. And I want to be micromanaged, but I do want to be microanalyzed, right? That's why I love David Johnson so much. He told me, you're not making sense.
Right.
I like it better now when he's giving me some constructive alternatives, but still that's so important, is that, the assumption is that I consider it a privilege and a gift to have everyone telling me what it is they think I'm doing wrong.
Yeah, so this passage is abstract. Is there an example in scripture of someone approaching it that way that you've just described it?
I don't think so. I don't think we have good role models of this. We have point-wise examples of it where it happens. Peter confronting Paul, or say Paul confronting Peter, the prophet Nathan considering David. So we have examples where it's celebrated as a good thing. But I think this is what's really interesting, is that we don't have examples of people doing it at scale or as a regular part of how they do business.
Yeah, maybe because the church was just kind of puny back then.
Maybe, but it's also, I think that one could argue there's two things that make this a lot easier for us to pull off. One is that, well, there's several things that make it. The big one, frankly, is that we are not concerned with existential survival, right? The church in the first century, was very much like, we've got to figure this thing out quickly.
Right.
And therefore, it's really important that we listen to the apostles and we adopt this posture of like figuring this out. And the second thing is also that communication technology was limited. You couldn't get 1,000 people to have a meaningful conversation. You had to have a council where like the 12 got together and made a decision, or later the council of bishops. And so conciliar decision-making was a brilliant innovation at the time, which later became a clever hack and is now an idiotic legacy, because we have much better information architectures for letting whole groups make a communal decision together, but we don't use them.
Yeah, I'll grant that thesis that maybe scripture did not show what this looks like.
They weren't able to, they showed this at small scale.
Yeah.
But it was not possible for them to scale it up.
Right.
And this is what the rant I had with David Johnson, where I say like, okay, when I say biblical, I mean like I want to live out what Jesus lived out.
Okay. So
but it doesn't mean I want to limit myself to the systems and structures that they happen to use at that time.
But what percent of mainstream Christians would say that council is not a great way to do things in 2020?
I mean, I don't know how many even would ask that question.
Right. That
right.
too.
So people can say all sorts of things, but if they haven't thought about it deeply, it's just a random opinion. It's not really a meaningful thing. I mean, most American Christians would tend to say that they prefer democracy to other systems. but I don't think even a majority of churches follow a congregational model.
Right.
Now, our church, I think, is actually relatively forward thinking in that we have an elder-led church where the elders have, in theory, absolute autonomy and power over the church. But in practice, they have an Episcopalian hierarchy that they practice relational submission to, and they have a cultural norm of extensively consulting the congregation on important decisions. And so I think that is a possibly best in class system, is where they try to have all three forms cooperating, but there's still a buck stop here with the Council of Elders. And in practice, even if they have different structural forms, I think that's how most churches operate, in that even if they have a congregational form, you have a committee which has practically high degrees of power.
I'll give you a modern day case example.
All right, I gotta go unleash a puppy. Keep talking.
Okay. You know, if you ask me, Bill, place a bet, which denomination will survive the next 500 or 1,000 years? Guess where my money is going to go. Mennonites.
Interesting. Okay, explain.
Well, you know the recent history of denominations, and it's pretty obvious a certain issue just rippled through and devastated all the traditional denominations, just split them right down the middle, but not the Mennonite church. So how do they approach it differently? And so the issue was, what's our stance on homosexuality? And so every major denomination had super contentious councils, and just when they thought they would kind of come together, a last minute flare up, and they always split into this branch and that branch. And we saw it most recently with Menlo Park Presbyterian Church. So that issue is not split the Mennonite church. So how did they approach it differently? They said, yeah, this seems like a pretty important issue. Let's take 15 to 20 years minimum to do deliberation around it. It's like God's timing is, you don't necessarily have to decide right now in 1995. It is a big issue. It affects a lot of people, but just don't do it like a high-powered public corporation where we gotta make the decision by next quarter or next year.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but that's just their heritage is, you know, they've been persecuted from the beginning, and they just seem to approach it. I don't want to say consensus is the right word, but there is
deliberative process.
Yeah, there is less. Let the Pope decide, or let the president of the Southern Baptist decide. And a lot more. Let's really work through the issue and talk, and give it some time for
right.
the issues to come up, and just work through that.
Right. So the other question is that where are they in that process?
It's not slow church or slow cooking. It's slow decision.
Right. So, but the question is, of course, there's two questions that come in. One is, have they reached a decision?
No.
So, right. So it is not yet obvious. So it's a thing to admire. But the two questions are: A, if they reach a decision, will they then?
Right.
Will it actually succeed in their goal of staying united and making a decision together? I mean, certainly it increases the odds that they will. The second question, though, is still an interesting one. You know, there is an advantage to taking slow, deliberative decisions, but there's also a cost you pay for that. And the hard thing is, you know, is this really wise? There's a wonderful Dilbert cartoon where Wally, the notorious slacker, he says, someone asked him, you know, we need a decision on the architecture. He goes, well, we need to wait until we've gathered all the requirements before we can really make a decision on the architecture. And Aslak the intern goes, I don't know if you're being wise or being lazy. And he goes, I've spent my entire career seeking to find that middle ground. He says, and I'm gonna go take a power nap now before I go do any more work, so I'm fresh. And it's like, you can't tell a priori whether they're being wise or being cowardly in how they approach that decision.
Yeah. So maybe
it's only really obvious in retrospect when you see
right.
how the decision played out, whether you can tell that was actually, wow, that was actually really great and consensus driven, or they just punted it downhill by trying to avoid the issue and bury it in committee.
Yeah, and I think only God can make that call. But two things I should say is, I didn't dive into this. They're principled, so it's not just like we think this is the right approach. They feel it's the Christian approach. So more needs to be said there.
Yeah, no, and I think they're right. But I mean, the other thing though is that I had a roommate who was a Mennonite, and I'm fascinated by the tradition. So I could easily imagine that this will work well for them and that they will continue to exist as a cohesive community 100 years from now. But I also strongly suspect that they're not going to be much larger than they are now, because that very deliberative community approach is what keeps them from scaling beyond their current size.
Yeah, in some sense, it's tortoise or hare, right?
Yeah, and well, the question is though, right, and the tortoise has a slow heartbeat and lives for 100 years. The rabbit has a high heartbeat and dies in 10. And what's interesting, of course, is that humans are the only organism that kind of breaks that iron law of metabolism.
Right.
Is that we live for 100 years even though we have a high metabolism. And that's the interesting design challenge, right? Can you create an organizational structure which allows rapid decision-making when necessary? I mean, the whole reason we have a presidential system in the US versus a confederacy is like having a singular leader who's got this dynamic energy to try and help the organization grow seemed essential for those to survive and thrive as a system. And this is also the libertarian paradox, is that organizations with strong central authorities actually are better at guaranteeing individual liberty than decentralized systems. It's counterintuitive, but empirically it's very much the case. Because in fact, when there is clear boundaries and a clear decision, it actually can give people more freedom. Yeah. And so the idea is that the way, yeah, sorry.
I mean, I'm just going back to what Nicole put out there, that because of a rushed decision by, I don't want to say the black churches to split, why do you think we have George Floyd hundreds of years later?
Sorry, a rushed decision by black churches to split. Could you be specific? Because I lost the.
In Passion Talk is that was a bad call. That
so
only
which specific call?
That only in America did the black church decide to separate from their white brothers.
When did that happen, and what was the specific?
1800s. So they formed black denominations separate from the historical, but not in Africa. You'd think it happened in Africa. No, they decided to not split, to not cause the rift. And so her whole thesis is that was a bad decision, and explains all the bad stuff.
Right, but I mean, you know that I'd like to, but I agree that may have been a bad decision. I don't know if it would be fair to call it rash, because it was happening in a decentralized fashion over decades, right? It wasn't like there was one single incident that everyone then sheepishly followed. Right, and certainly there was enormous pressures shaping that. I mean, and certainly it wasn't like there were a lot of, I mean, I'm more familiar with the flip side of it after the Azusa Street revival, where the white pastors split off from the black-led movement, which was, and you know, there's all sorts of, regardless, so the speed of decision-making is an interesting one, but I don't think it's like slow is always better than fast. I don't think you can say that. Or all bad decisions are because of too much speed.
No, so the Mennonites don't say, hey, we're having a get together. We'd like to just have dinner. Let's spend 20 years deciding which flavor of tea to serve, right?
Right.
It's like the amount of time put in is proportional to the seriousness of the issue. That's all I'm saying.
Well, yeah, but I'm saying that even that is not a foolproof thing. Like if there's a fight, you're saying that the more serious it is, the longer you should take to make a decision. So what if the building you're having your potluck in is burning down? that's a really, really important thing that needs to be decided quickly, how to get people out of the building.
I didn't use the word, I was struggling which word to use, which Ash did. Not
You said
important,
seriousness.
complex, or precedent making.
Well, fair enough. But I mean, the point is that so the importance of the issue is one thing, the complexity of another thing, but there's also urgency. And the point is that urgency, complexity, and importance do not always perfectly line up.
Yeah, so I think Jesus talks an awful lot about peace and urgency, and pretty strong contrast between the ways of the world. It's like, it's obvious we have to decide right now. It's like, in God's timing, not necessarily. That's not necessarily the most important issue. So when I was involved with church governance, what really got me sad was what they felt were the important issues.
Or the urgent issues, yeah.
Yeah, and it's
but my point is that it's not easy, is that there are things that are urgent where, and like, in fact, the biggest one, frankly, like our friends at Menlo Park find out, is church discipline. If there's someone who's, behaving badly in whatever level of behaving that you want, that affects other people, there's this tension, there's enormous tension between wanting to get all the facts, wanting to have a good consensus, wanting to avoid causing any damage, and making sure that no greater harm takes place. And, dithering on a really important, complex issue that actually requires urgent action, I would argue, is not wise. And so it's really hard to balance those. I'm not saying what the right answer is. I'm saying that taking it slow is not always the right trade-off. So what I'm proposing precisely is kind of the inverse, is that you need to have leaders who are empowered to take decisive action when necessary, but they need to be, the way you do that is by increasing accountability without increasing micromanagement. And that's the interesting design pattern I wanted to explore with the Great Reset, and my role in particular, is like, I actually feel like, for example, I've been rewriting the purpose statement multiple times, and I don't need prior approval to post a new purpose statement. It's not like I micromanage that way. But I am certainly accountable to the group in that they say, I don't like it. And in fact, it is my job to figure out how to structure the group to make it easier for people to provide useful, actionable feedback.
Well, that's good.
And I think that's this idea of being is embodying this verse of scripture. That the greatest is the one who is called to serve all, is like, that's actually the primary job of the leader, is not to ensure the integrity of the group as it is, or the existing power structure. The primary job is to figure out how to ensure that he is serving all. And that if I get, it starts with, there is some shared mission and some shared vision, but that the other really, this is getting, I gotta go on off my next group, is that it's a matter of becoming rather than being. All right, I'm gonna leave it on that line and jump off to my next Zoom call.
Okay, and I'll just say, I see the word called. So in some sense, the one that God called is the one you follow.
Yeah, and then, all right.
Thanks.
Phil.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.